When I was in school, I hated textbooks. I found them boring, tedious, and frankly, useless. In fact, some of my proudest moments in school were getting A's in classes where I never bothered to buy the textbook at all. So imagine my surprise when years later I found out that I had just been using them wrong for my entire academic career, and I could have made my life infinitely easier if I just understood how to use a textbook correctly. So in this video, I want to show you the right way to use a textbook so you don't make the same mistakes I did and hopefully make your life a little bit easier. The first thing we need to talk about when we talk about reading textbooks is when should you read a textbook? Well, if you read a textbook a couple days before your final exam, then I think we can all agree that at that point, it's probably too late. And so step one, don't read it the last minute, not going to be helpful. So we have to assume then, because every professor tells us you should read the textbook before coming to class, the right time to read a textbook is just before going to class, right? Wrong. So if you're not reading the textbook before going to class, what are you doing? Well, what I suggest you do before you go to your next lecture is you figure out what chapters are going to be covered in that lecture, and you do crack open that textbook. But what you're going to do is not actually what anyone would really qualify as reading. So in order to demonstrate what this looks like, I'm going to use a textbook that I've used in previous years, a business communication textbook, and I'm using the online version of that. This method works just as well using a physical textbook. In fact, a physical textbook is probably even easier, but for the purposes of recording a video, the electronic version is just easier and for us to get on the screen. So let's look at, if you're not reading the textbook, what are you actually doing? So step one, figure out what chapter you're reading. And so in this chapter, we're looking at chapter 10, Persuasive Messages. And what I'm going to do as I go through this chapter is I'm not going to read every single word in the chapter. This is probably a 30 or 40 page long chapter. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time understanding what the learning objectives are for the chapter. And most textbooks will start with sort of either what we call learning objectives or sort of a summary of what's going to be covered in the chapter. This is probably the most important part in the chapter, and you should spend a few minutes reading this part and really understanding everything that is in this section to the best of your ability. Okay, so once you've read through that, then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to go through the chapter and you're going to skim through it really, really quickly. And what you're going to focus on is all of the headings. So in this case, after the learning objectives, we have a case study. We're going to skip over the case study for now. We're going to move to the next page. And then we start with our headings. So starting with the importance of credibility in an era of mistrust and skepticism. And you can see in this specific textbook, it relates the heading back to one of the learning objectives. And so we're now going to keep going through and we're going to look at the various headings and key terms that are going to be called out. Pay special attention to things like graphics and the captions to graphics, because normally these are going to be highlighting key points. So in the post-trust era, persuasion is more challenging. That's a general point that the textbook is trying to make. And we're going to keep moving on. How do you apply the AIM planning process to persuasive messages? And then here you have a graphic here that is showing you what the AIM planning process is. So looking at your audience, the information, your message, and that's how you develop your plan. We're going to talk about persuading through shared purpose and shared values. So these are two ways to do persuasion. Show people they are sincerely needed and appreciated. Understand methods of influence. And then as I'm going through this, I'm going to see, oh, there's these little bolded words here that are essentially definitions. So if in the online version of this textbook, you can actually click on the word and it will give you the definition. That is something you definitely want to pay attention to. In the printed version of the textbook, it'll probably just be bolded and there'll be a glossary somewhere else. But if these words are bolded, it means they're important. Again, take a look at images when they're relevant. If they're not, skip over them. Look at anything that has a definition, read through that. Again, you're going to want to look at your various headers. The other thing to look for, in addition to your images and in addition to your headers, is you're going to want to pay attention to any kind of call-out boxes like this, because generally speaking, these call-out boxes are summarizing the most important information in the text that you're actually reading through, right? So if I've done this, if I have gone through all of the headings and looked at the call-out boxes and taken a look at the different words that have definitions, and I've read through that, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the end of the chapter, and most textbooks at the end of the chapter will usually have exercises, and I'm going to read through the exercises. to understand what kind of questions could be asked about this specific chapter. And once I've done those, once I've read through all these questions, I'm not necessarily going to do all the questions, but I want to understand the types of questions that could be asked. I am then going to go back to the beginning of the chapter, and I am going to go back to these learning objectives. And I'm going to ask myself, based on just this really quick skim that I have done of graphics, of callouts, of headings, and of questions, how close am I to actually understanding these various elements? Even if your answer is not all that close, that is where I want you to stop. I don't want you to go any further before going to your lecture. What you're going to do at this point before you get to your lecture is you're going to take all the information that you just gathered by skimming quickly through this textbook. And if you've done this correctly, this is probably taking you maybe 10 or 15 minutes as opposed to the probably hour and a half, 2 hours it would take you to read everything from beginning to end of that chapter. And I want you to basically create a skeleton or an outline of what your notes for a lecture about this chapter could look like. I already have a video on how to take notes in a lecture, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But essentially what I'm looking for here is just put down the keywords or concepts that stuck out to you that you know that you're going to want to elaborate on when you get to the lecture. Now, once you're in the lecture, taking notes becomes really simple because essentially all you're going to do during the lecture is you're going to fill in the blanks of whatever was in your notes skeleton that you put together after skimming through your textbook. And you're going to fill out that skeleton to the best of your ability so that you have really robust notes based on the lecture that you just attended. Okay, so I've skimmed through the textbook. I've created this sort of outline of this sort of skeleton of what my notes will look like. And then I've filled in that skeleton by attending the lecture. Lecture's over. So surely this is the point at which I'm going to go back and I'm going to read the entire textbook, right? Wrong. Instead of going back and reading the entire textbook, what I want you to do now is I want you to go back to those practice questions that were at the end of the chapter, and I want you to do as many of them as you possibly can. I want you to figure out what the answers to that look like, and I want you really to give it your all. By doing this, what you're doing is if there's information that is missing, you will quickly start to see where that information is. And as you are answering these questions, the goal of doing these questions is not to try and do them like a closed book exam. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's to answer these questions sort of like as an open book exam. So answer the questions, and whatever you're not sure about or whatever you don't know, at this point, you're going to go back into the chapter of the textbook and you're going to hunt for the answer to that question. And as you fill out those questions, you are going to realize that you're actually learning something. I've talked about this a lot in other videos when I talk about how learning actually works. Learning is not a passive process. You don't learn by reading. You don't learn by sitting back and listening to someone lecture to you. You learn by applying the information that you've absorbed. By doing these practice questions and actually forcing yourself to go look for answers, that's how you're actually going to be encoding information into your brain that you can then recall later when you need that information, whether it be for an exam or, if you're actually following this process and you're actually learning properly, you're actually going to be able to remember this information months and even years down the line, as opposed to just using it when you need it for a final and then forgetting everything that you just learned. Throughout the semester, you're going to want to come back to your practice questions and you're going to want to make sure that you still know how to answer them. Places that are a little bit fuzzier, you're going to want to go back and you are going to want to review those specific portions of the textbook. As you go through more material, it'll help you flesh out the questions from previous chapters that you reviewed, and so you'll have better answers. You'll be able to connect the material together a little bit better. So you're going to have this sort of ongoing review, but you're never actually going to come back and read that chapter end to end. And if you're doing this, if you are going back through these questions and you're reviewing the material that you've taken notes on a regular basis, and you're actively practicing finding connections between concepts, doing just that will allow you to have 95% of the work done for preparing for a final exam. And you have understood and better internalized this information more than most students who will spend much, much longer reading textbooks, highlighting passages, taking really long detailed notes, summarizing chapters. All of that stuff, which takes a ton of time, is going to be nowhere near as effective as the minimum amount of work that you put in to understand the concepts at the core of your book. And at this point, you're probably asking yourself, but wait, Adam, so if I do what you're saying, when do I actually read the entire textbook? When do I actually read all of the text from cover to cover? And the short answer is never. You don't. You don't have to. And that is the big mistake a lot of people make when they are using textbooks for courses. Textbooks are not narrative. They're not like a nonfiction book or a novel where the goal is to start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. Textbooks are more like reference materials. They're more like encyclopedias. For anyone who was born after encyclopedias were a thing, think about Wikipedia but condensed down into 20 books. The idea here is no one ever sat down to read the encyclopedia from A to Z. Instead, what they're doing is they're using it as a place where they're going to go look for specific pieces of information. And that's how I want you to use your textbook. It's not a piece of literature that you are going to consume in a traditional fashion. It's a reference point where you are going to come back and look for specific answers to help you supplement the knowledge that you've gained through exercises, through lectures, through assignments, through a bunch of other things. That is the right way to use a textbook. If you've been reading textbooks, summarizing textbooks, highlighting textbooks, and you've hated it this entire time, which is what I did when I was in school, that is the reason why you've hated it. It's because you've been using textbooks wrong this entire time. And now you're asking, but what if I want to read it? Knock yourself out. Go for it. Go crazy. If it's a topic that's really interesting to you, go ahead and read your textbook. You might learn something extra that is not part of what was being covered in the course. You might find that it helps add to sort of the stuff that you've already learned. But for the vast majority of people, reading a textbook is not actually going to be helpful. If you want to, no one's going to stop you, but it's not necessarily going to be the most effective way for you to learn the material in that book. Remember that when you have a textbook, the value comes from searching and not from reading. That's why using the textbook as a reference point to come back and find answers from, as opposed to something that you're just going to read cover to cover, is so much more important. And now that you know how to read a textbook, you may want to take a look at this other video about how to take lecture notes or how not to take lecture notes, as the case may be. And until next time, cheers.